You step out onto the cobblestone streets of a bustling medieval town. The air is thick, a symphony of pungent smells assaults your nose. Wood smoke mingles with the sharp tang of animal waste, and something else, a peculiar aroma of cooking food. Your stomach rumbles. Vendors shout their wares, their voices echoing between timber-framed buildings. You see steaming pies, roasted meats on spits, and warm bread. It all looks so inviting, a quick and easy meal for the weary traveler or busy merchant. But peel back the illusion of convenience and comfort, and you will discover a darker, much more unsanitary truth. Prepare yourself. Because the street food of the Middle Ages was not just a feast for your belly, it was often a perilous gamble for your very life. We are about to uncover the truly disgusting realities that lurked in every bite. You stand before a vendor's stall, the smell of sizzling fat promising a quick, hot meal. But look closely. The wooden counter where the vendor slices his meat is dark with age and an unidentifiable film. It has seen countless cuts, countless hands, and very few cleanings. Around the edges, a small army of houseflies buzzes, drawn by the scent of fresh blood or the lingering sweetness of spilled ale. They land on the uncooked portions, then perhaps on the cooked ones, before taking flight again to investigate the piles of refuse just a few paces away. This is not just a nuisance. It is a visual confirmation of what lurks beneath the surface of supposed sustenance. This is not a modern kitchen with stainless steel and running water. This is the open street, a repository for everything the town produces, good and bad. Mud and animal droppings coat the cobblestones. Human waste, sometimes casually tossed from upper windows or deposited in overflowing cesspits, adds to the unspeakable cocktail of the street floor. The very air you breathe carries invisible particulate matter of life, decay and dust. And it is here, amidst this vibrant chaos and pervasive filth, that your food is prepared. Imagine the ingredients. The meat, for example. Perhaps it is a cut of mutton or pork, roasted to a tempting golden brown. But where did this meat come from? Often, it was not the prime cut from a healthy, recently slaughtered animal. Instead, street vendors would often purchase the cheapest cuts, sometimes from animals that had died of disease, or those too old or sickly to be useful for anything else. A butcher might sell a vendor meat that was already on the turn, perhaps trimmed of its most obvious blemishes, but still carrying the seeds of illness within its fibers. You would not know, of course. The vendor, shouting their wares, would simply assure you of its freshness, perhaps with a boisterous laugh. Once acquired, this meat was rarely refrigerated. Ice houses were a luxury, and ice itself a seasonal commodity for the wealthy. So the meat sat, often for hours, sometimes for a full day or more, exposed to the ambient temperature. In summer, the heat would be a prolific breeding ground for bacteria. In winter, perhaps a little safer, but still far from ideal. Then it would be cooked, often over an open flame, the heat intended to burn away any suspicions. But cooking, especially hurried street cooking, does not always destroy every pathogen. An undercooked center, a piece left warm for too long after initial cooking, these were common dangers you gambled with every day. Consider the pies. A staple of medieval street food. A thick pastry crust, sometimes quite elaborate, hiding a filling of meat or fish. The crust itself served a dual purpose. It was a cheap way to fill a hungry belly, and it also acted as a protective casing, theoretically keeping the contents fresh. But what were those contents? Often, the fillings were made from the lowest quality ingredients, scraps of meat, gristle, or even diseased organs. The faint, sickly sweet smell of beginning decay, subtly masked by a heavy hand with cheap spices, might hang in the air around some stalls. You almost do not notice it until a fly, fatter and slower than the others, settles for a long drink on a discarded crust near the vendor's feet. The spices used were not just for flavor. They were also vital for masking the unpleasant taste and smell of decaying ingredients. A strong pepper or a dash of ginger could make even questionable meat palatable, at least to your senses. The pie crust, while protective, also made it impossible for you to inspect the filling before purchase. You simply had to trust the vendor. And trust, in this cutthroat world of medieval commerce, was often a luxury you could not afford. Some unscrupulous vendors were known to pass off cat or dog meat as more desirable fare, especially to unsuspecting travelers. The tough, sinewy texture would be hard to distinguish once minced and heavily spiced within a robust pastry shell. This was not just about cutting costs, it was about outright deception, where you paid for one thing and potentially received another, far more harmful substance. The economic pressures on vendors were immense, driving many to such desperate and dishonest practices. Now turn your gaze to the vendor themselves. Their hands, calloused and busy, handle coins, wipe sweat from their brow, swat at flies, and then reach directly for your food. There is no running water for hand washing. No soap. If they are lucky, a bucket of murky water might be nearby, perhaps used for rinsing a spoon, but certainly not for personal hygiene in any modern sense. Dust from the street, grime from their clothes, and whatever else they have touched throughout the day, all could transfer directly to your meal. Their clothes themselves tell a story. Soiled aprons, stained tunics, evidence of a day spent battling smoke, grease, and the general muck of the marketplace. This is their uniform, their everyday attire, and it offers no barrier against contamination. The water used for cooking and washing up, if any washing up happens at all, would likely come from the nearest communal well or river. While some rivers provided fresh water, many urban waterways were heavily polluted, serving as open sewers for human and animal waste, as well as industrial refuse from tanneries or dye works. Boiling this water for cooking would help, but not all vendors bothered, especially if simply rinsing vegetables or preparing a broth for a stew or pottage. Consider those large pots of simmering stew or porridge, hot food served in thick, communal bowls. The broth, a mixture of mystery ingredients, often simmered for days, merely refreshed with new additions rather than made fresh. This meant that anything already in the pot, any bacteria from old meat or unwashed vegetables, had ample time to multiply and thrive in the warm, stagnant liquid. You drink a cup of ale or weak beer thinking it's safer than water, and often it was, but the quality of ingredients and the hygiene of the brewing process could also vary wildly. Consider the other elements around the stall. The wooden cutting boards, never truly cleaned, harbored bacteria in every groove and crack. The knives, dull and grimy, would be wiped on an apron or perhaps rinsed in a communal bucket of murky water. The serving dishes, perhaps a wooden trencher or a crude pottery bowl, would be quickly wiped clean with a cloth that has seen better days, if cleaned at all between customers. There is no concept of sanitization as you understand it. Germ theory is centuries away. The connection between filth and disease is not yet made in any scientific, widely understood way. So you are left with observation. You see the flies, constant companions of every food stall, crawling over the warm bread, investigating the roasted fowl, even alighting on the vendor's face. It is not just a few flies, it is a shimmering, buzzing cloud that seems to follow the scent of food, settling, crawling, then darting off, only to return to another dish. They are the true connoisseurs of this street food, sampling every morsel before you do. These flies have just come from the piles of dung, from the open latrine, from the carcass of a dead dog festering in the sun. They are tireless vectors of disease, ferrying countless microorganisms directly to the food you are about to consume. Rats, too, are an omnipresent threat, though perhaps less visible during the bustling daylight hours. But at night, when the stalls are closed, they would emerge from the shadows, scavenging for scraps, contaminating any uncovered food left behind. Dogs and cats, both wild and domestic, roamed freely, sniffing and occasionally sampling fallen morsels, adding another layer of animal-borne contamination to the already precarious food chain. The bread, often sold fresh and warm, might seem a safer bet. But even bread could be suspect. The flour might be adulterated with cheaper, less wholesome ingredients such as chalk, sawdust, or even ground beans. The baker's hands, the conditions of the bakery, the water used to mix the dough, all contributed to its potential for contamination. And once baked, it was often left uncovered, stacked high, exposed to the same dust, flies, and street air as everything else. Even simpler fare, like roasted nuts or dried fruit, presented its own hazards. How were they stored? Were they protected from rodents and insects? Were they sold from a communal basket where many hands had already rummaged? The answers, more often than not, would fill you with a deep sense of unease. The medieval town was a vibrant, noisy, exciting place, but it was also a profoundly unsanitary one. The very air you breathe carries the invisible particulate matter of human and animal life, decay and dust. This particulate matter settles on everything, especially on the openly displayed food. There are no glass cases, no protective barriers beyond perhaps a thin cloth. Your meal sits, exposed, a testament to the hardiness of medieval stomachs and the omnipresent threat of disease. Eating street food was a necessity for many, a convenience for others. But it was always a gamble. You might get lucky, enjoy a hot, filling meal without consequence. Or you might ingest a cocktail of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that would lead to agonizing stomach cramps, fever, dysentery, or worse. The casual indifference to hygiene, the lack of understanding about disease transmission, and the sheer desperation for sustenance meant that every bite was a risk. The grimy grub was precisely that, grimy. A banquet for flies and an open invitation for illness to take root within you. While the grime itself was a problem, what exactly was lurking within that food you contemplated buying? What were those tempting aromas truly hiding? Let us peer beyond the smoke and the bustling crowds to examine the heart of medieval street food. Its ingredients, especially its meats. This was a realm of profound uncertainty, where every bite was a gamble not just on your purse but on your very life. You stand before a street vendor's stall, perhaps a butcher's shop spilling its wares onto the thoroughfare, or a mobile cart with a bubbling pot. The sight is not one of pristine cuts of meat neatly arrayed under cooling lights. Instead, you see hunks of flesh hanging openly, often still bearing the marks of their hurried slaughter. Flies buzz with audacious indifference, sampling the wares before any human customer. The air is thick with a complicated scent, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the earthy musk of animal hides, and the acrid notes of poorly rendered fat. The animals that provided this meat were often not the plump, healthy specimens destined for a lord's table. Think instead of the old, the infirm, the scrawny, or even the recently deceased. A peasant's cow might succumb to illness, a pig might die of neglect. Such an animal, worthless to its owner for milk or labor, could still be sold for a pittance to a less scrupulous butcher or a desperate cook. Once stripped of its hide and cut into pieces, especially if heavily spiced and boiled or roasted, who could truly tell its origin or its prior state of health? This was the genesis of your mystery meat. The term mystery meat was not a medieval phrase, but its essence defined the era's street food. There was little to no regulation, no health inspections, no branding to assure you of quality or origin. A vendor might claim his pie was filled with succulent pork, but what truly lay beneath that thick, often greasy crust? Could be anything. Dog meat, cat meat, the flesh of pigeons caught from the eaves, or even more disturbing, the remnants of animals already partially decayed, their putrefaction masked by artful preparation. While documented cases of such deceptions are rare, the fear and suspicion of them were very real. Imagine paying good money for a hearty meal, only to later discover its true horrifying contents. The thought alone would curdle your stomach. Consider the pies and pasties, a cornerstone of medieval street cuisine. These were portable, filling, and deceptively appealing. They were also the perfect vessel for deceit. The pastry, often made with coarse flour and animal fat, was dense and substantial, capable of holding its shape and concealing its contents. Inside, the meat would be minced, mixed with onions, herbs, and most importantly, an abundance of strong spices. Pepper, ginger, cloves, and cinnamon were not just flavor enhancers. They were vital tools in the culinary arsenal, potent enough to overpower the faint, slightly off odors of aging or even beginning to spoil meat. Without refrigeration, spoilage was a constant threat, and spices were the only line of defense against both taste and smell. You bite into a pie, perhaps a hot pasty you bought from a woman with flour-dusted hands. The initial warmth is comforting, the spice is intriguing. But is there a subtle gamey flavor that is more than just exotic? Is the texture a little too soft, a little too stringy? You may shrug it off, attributing it to unfamiliar preparation. Hunger, after all, is a powerful seasoning. You need the calories, the protein, the warmth against the chill. Your body craves sustenance, and the risk, though perhaps subconsciously acknowledged, is outweighed by immediate need. Sausages were another prime suspect in the mystery meat lineup. Ground meat, fat, offal, and fillers like stale breadcrumbs or grains, all stuffed into animal intestines. This was an excellent way to utilize every scrap of an animal, ensuring nothing went to waste. But it also meant that sausages were a veritable Pandora's box of ingredients. If a butcher had some questionable trimmings or an animal that was not quite fresh, grinding it into a sausage with liberal amounts of spice and salt could make it pass muster. The fat would render, the spices would mask, and the intense cooking process would hopefully render it edible. Yet, the pathogens that cause illness are not always destroyed by cooking, especially if the internal temperature is not high enough or sustained for long enough. Then there are the roasted meats on skewers or small birds offered on spits. These might seem safer, less prone to hidden ingredients. But again, consider the source. An older, tougher bird or a less desirable cut of meat might be roasted until its exterior was appealingly browned and crackling, while its interior remained stubbornly undercooked or of poor quality. The fat would drip and sizzle, creating an enticing aroma that could easily lead your nose astray. You might purchase a roasted pigeon, its skin crisp, but discover the meat is stringy, tough, and barely enough to satisfy your hunger, let alone provide quality nutrition. These were the mortal morsels. The risks inherent in consuming such fare were enormous. Without any understanding of germ theory, people did not connect their agonizing stomach cramps or sudden fevers to the meal they had just consumed. But the connection was undeniably there. Food poisoning was rampant. Bacteria like Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria harbored in poorly sourced or improperly handled meat were a constant threat. Imagine the sudden violent onset of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, perhaps accompanied by a debilitating fever that leaves you shivering uncontrollably. In an age without modern medicine, such an affliction could quickly lead to severe dehydration and death, especially for the very young, the elderly, or those already weakened by poverty and malnutrition. Parasites were another invisible danger. Trichinosis, caused by a worm found in undercooked pork, was common. Eating infected meat could lead to severe muscle pain, fever, and digestive problems, often a chronic and debilitating condition. Tapeworms, too, were a silent scourge, growing unseen within the intestines, slowly draining their host of nutrients, causing weakness and general ill health. These were not considered rare or exotic diseases. They were an accepted, if unwelcome, part of life. The lack of basic hygiene amplified these dangers. Butcher's blocks, rarely cleaned thoroughly, would be covered in remnants of various meats, cross-contaminating everything. Hands used to handle raw meat, money, and other goods would then touch cooked food. Water used for washing or diluting was often itself contaminated. Flies, carrying filth from nearby latrines and refuse, would alight on open food, transferring unseen armies of bacteria. You take your chances because you must. For many, street food was not a choice of convenience, but a necessity born of economic reality. You are a laborer with no cooking hearth, or a traveler passing through, or a pauper whose meager coins stretch only far enough for a ready-made meal. The vendor offers a warm pie, a tempting sausage, a roasted scrap of bird. It is cheap, It is hot and it promises to fill the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. The alternative might be going hungry, a far more immediate and certain suffering. So you eat. You chew, you swallow, and you hope. You hope that the spices have done their job, that the heat has cooked away any lurking dangers, and that the animal from which your meal came was relatively healthy. You play the medieval lottery with every bite, risking discomfort, sickness, or even the ultimate price. These were not gourmet experiences. These were survival rations, offered with a side of pervasive, invisible risk, a testament to the harsh realities of a world that cared little for the delicate constitution of its inhabitants. Beyond the dubious origins of the meat itself, the cooking vessel, that iron pot simmering over an open flame, presented its own unique and deeply unsettling hazards. Imagine for a moment the life of such a pot. It is large, heavy, and a permanent fixture over a flickering fire or a bed of glowing coals. It is the heart of the street food operation, the source of warmth and sustenance for countless hungry souls. Day after day, it bubbles and seethes, churning out one stew or porridge after another. Now consider the cleaning routine, or rather the distinct lack thereof. In an era devoid of soap as we know it, without hot running water, and with no understanding whatsoever of microscopic organisms, the concept of sterile cleanliness simply did not exist. The vendor, busy from dawn until dusk, would scrape out the remnants of one batch, perhaps giving the pot a cursory wipe with a rough cloth or a handful of straw. A quick splash of cold, often unfiltered, water might follow, if they were feeling particularly diligent. Then, without further ado, the next ingredients would be tossed in, settling down into the accumulating layers of the past. You stand by the stall, watching the vendor ladle out a thick, steaming portion. Your eyes are drawn to the inside of the pot. Along its edges, a dark, encrusted ring tells a story of countless meals gone by. Burned-on fat, dried fragments of meat, congealed sauces, and forgotten vegetables cling stubbornly to the iron. This isn't just old food, this is a thriving ecosystem. Every crevice, every tiny scratch in the metal, becomes a sanctuary for bacteria. They multiply unseen, feasting on the organic residue, releasing their metabolic byproducts. When a fresh batch of ingredients is added, they don't just cook in the new liquid, they commingle with the ghosts of meals past. The heat might kill some of the active bacteria, yes, but it does little to eliminate the toxins they have already produced. Some bacteria, especially those responsible for serious foodborne illnesses, can form heat-resistant spores, lying dormant until conditions are just right to reactivate. So, while the stew might appear to boil vigorously beneath the surface, a silent and potent danger is brewing. Think of the sheer variety of items that might pass through this single vessel. Perhaps it started the day with a thick oat-based porridge for breakfast, then transitioned to a vegetable and bean stew for lunch. By afternoon, it might be frying up small fish or simmering a meat pie filling. Each culinary adventure leaves its indelible mark, a microscopic smear that cross-contaminates the next dish. A stray drop of raw meat juice from this morning's cutting board could find its way into the pot, only to simmer gently for hours, an unintended ingredient in your evening meal. The water used for cooking itself might be suspect. Drawn from a communal well, a river, or a rain barrel, it was rarely purified. These sources were often shared with livestock, used for washing clothes, and served as convenient dumping grounds for human waste. So, even if the pot were miraculously spotless, the very medium in which your food was cooked carried its own cargo of pathogens. You receive your serving, perhaps a hearty bowl of pottage. The aroma is strong, the steam inviting. But as you take your first bite, you might detect a subtle, unfamiliar tang, a hint of something sour or metallic beneath the spices. It is difficult to pinpoint, easy to dismiss as just part of the rustic charm of street food. Your stomach rumbles with hunger, overriding any fleeting suspicion. You eat because you must. But the consequences are often swift and brutal. Within hours, or perhaps a day or two, your gut begins to rebel. The subtle tang becomes a churning pain. Diarrhea, vomiting, crippling stomach cramps, and fever were not just common complaints in medieval life. They were almost an accepted part of the human condition. They were so prevalent, in fact, that people rarely connected them directly to the last meal they ate from a street vendor. They blamed bad air, an imbalance of humors, or simply bad luck. They attributed it to everything but the unseen enemy thriving in that perpetually used, never truly clean iron pot. This was the quiet, constant threat that accompanied every meal purchased on the medieval street. A threat amplified by the vendor's pragmatic choices. Why waste precious firewood and time scrubbing a pot to a shine when a quick scrape would suffice? Why use more water than absolutely necessary when fetching it was arduous labor? The immediate concerns of cost, time, and effort outweighed any distant, poorly understood concept of hygiene. So, when you consider the medieval lottery of street food, it wasn't just about the freshness of the ingredients or the skill of the cook. It was also, fundamentally, about the vessel itself. That dark, heavy pot was not merely a tool. It was a silent, simmering incubator, continuously brewing sickness into the very heart of the community. Every helping dished out was a calculated risk, a gamble with your own well-being, played out daily on the bustling, unsanitary stages of the medieval marketplace. It was a world where illness was a constant companion, and the unwashed pot, a tireless accomplice. The unwashed pot, that tireless accomplice, was only one layer of the danger you faced. For beyond the silent threat of grime and bacteria, a more insidious enemy awaited your coin, the vendor themselves. Imagine, if you will, the bustling marketplace, a cacophony of hawkers and hagglers, of tantalizing smells and questionable sights. You approach a stall, your stomach rumbling, your purse perhaps a little lighter than you would like. What you see, however, is not always what you get. In the medieval street food scene, the art of deception was as finely honed as any artisan's craft, transforming your anticipated meal into a carefully constructed illusion. Walk with me now, past the steaming cauldrons and the sizzling spits, into the shadowy practices of these culinary tricksters. Their motivations were simple: profit, survival, and the ever-present pressure of a demanding, often uncritical market. What difference did a little sawdust in the bread make, they might rationalize, when hunger gnawed at the belly of the buyer? What harm was there in a dash of something extra to stretch out a precious commodity? Consider the most fundamental of foods: bread. You might imagine a simple loaf, baked fresh that morning. But the medieval baker, especially the street vendor, was a master of adulteration. Flour, that vital ingredient, was routinely cut with cheaper, less palatable, and often outright dangerous substitutes. Ground beans, peas, or vetch might bulk up the loaf, adding a coarse texture and a peculiar taste. But it could get far worse. Imagine, if you dare, your daily bread containing chalk, clay, or even fine sand, added to increase its weight and whiten its appearance, fooling the eye into believing it was made from purer, more expensive wheat. Some unscrupulous bakers were known to sweep the mill floor, gathering every last bit of flour dust, along with whatever else had settled there, and incorporating it into their dough. Each bite you took was a silent lottery, a question mark hovering over the very staff of life. Now turn your gaze to the street vendors specializing in meat pies and savory pasties. These were popular, portable meals, perfect for a busy laborer or a traveler on the go. But they were also the perfect canvas for deceit. The rich pastry crust, often thick and golden brown, concealed a world of culinary secrets. What kind of meat, you might wonder, lurked beneath that inviting shell? Often, it was not the succulent beef or tender mutton you had hoped for. Scraps of dubious origin, offal from animals that had died of disease, or even the flesh of cats and dogs, were sometimes passed off as more desirable game or cuts. The strong spices prevalent in medieval cooking were not just for flavor. They were essential for masking the telltale scent and taste of decaying or unfamiliar meats. A pie hot from the vendor's brazier might emit an aroma of cloves and cinnamon, lulling you into a false sense of security. But peel back that crust, and you might discover a filling that was not only unappetizing but genuinely hazardous to your health. The laws, such as they were, tried to curb these practices. Bakers faced the pillory for short-weighing their loaves, and butchers were threatened with fines for selling putrid flesh. But enforcement was sporadic, and the anonymous nature of street vending made it easy for rogues to operate. You, the customer, were often poorly equipped to discern the truth. Without the benefit of modern food science and relying solely on your senses, it was easy to be fooled by a convincing smell or a cleverly disguised appearance. Think of the fishmongers, for example. Fish was a crucial part of the medieval diet, especially on fast days. But freshness was a fleeting commodity in an age without refrigeration. An honest fishmonger would sell their catch swiftly. A dishonest one, however, might resort to desperate measures. Rotten fish could be heavily salted, smoked, or marinated in vinegar to mask its decay. Sometimes, a sprinkling of fresh parsley or a dash of expensive spices might be used to trick the nose. You purchase what appears to be a fine piece of cod, only to discover later, when the mask of spices has worn off, that it is utterly spoiled. Your stomach will pay the price for this deception. Drinks, too, were not immune to fraud. Ale and wine were staple beverages, often safer than water. But vendors frequently diluted their products with water, often of questionable purity, to increase their volume and profit margins. Ale might be weakened or wine might be mixed with cheap, inferior vintages, sometimes even colored with berries or other additives to appear richer than it was. Imagine settling down for a refreshing pint, only to find it thin, watery, and perhaps harboring a suspicious aftertaste. The medieval pub or street stall was not always the place for an honest brew. Even the humble spice merchant was not above a bit of trickery. Spices were incredibly valuable, often worth their weight in silver. This made them prime targets for adulteration. Black pepper might be mixed with juniper berries, ground mustard seeds, or even ordinary dust and dirt. Saffron, one of the most expensive spices, was frequently bulked out with dried marigold petals, dyed fibers, or even grated horseradish. You paid a premium for exotic flavor, only to receive a concoction of cheap fillers and clever imitations. The very ingredients meant to enhance your meal could be a source of deliberate fraud. The vendors of hot-cooked meals, such as stews and pottages, faced their own unique temptations. These dishes were often a mix of whatever was available, simmered for hours. This long cooking time was both a blessing and a curse. It could tenderize tough cuts of meat and meld flavors, but it could also effectively disguise the true nature of the ingredients. Old, stale vegetables, questionable meat scraps, or even offal that would be rejected by a more discerning cook, could all find their way into the communal pot, slowly breaking down into an anonymous, heavily spiced sludge. The vendor would assure you of its wholesome goodness, spooning out a generous helping into your wooden bowl, but the true contents remained a mystery, hidden beneath a thick layer of seasoning and a long, slow simmer. This culture of deception wasn't merely about individual rogue vendors. It was systemic, born from a combination of economic pressure, limited oversight, and a general lack of consumer protection. For you, the medieval customer, choices were often limited. You couldn't simply switch to another supermarket if you were unsatisfied. The street vendor was often your most accessible and affordable option. You relied on trust, but trust was a fragile commodity in the cutthroat world of the medieval marketplace. Think about the psychological impact. Every purchase was a gamble. You might be hungry, tired, and simply trying to get through your day. But with every bite, you were also contending with the possibility of being cheated, of consuming something unsavory or even dangerous. This constant vigilance, this underlying suspicion, must have been an exhausting burden. The guilds, those powerful associations of artisans and merchants, did attempt to regulate quality and prevent fraud within their ranks. Bakers, butchers, and fishmongers all had rules and inspections. But street vendors, often operating outside established guild structures, were harder to control. They were often transient, setting up their stalls wherever they could attract a crowd, making them difficult to track and hold accountable. A vendor caught selling spoiled meat in one town could simply pack up their cart and move to the next, ready to ply their dishonest trade anew. So, the next time you envision a vibrant medieval market, do not just picture the colorful banners and the lively crowds. Peer closer and you will see the subtle art of deception at play. The baker's sleight of hand with the scales, the pie seller's dubious fillings, the fishmonger's clever disguises, the alewife's watered-down brew. Every transaction carried a hidden risk, a silent battle of wits between the seller eager to maximize profit, and the buyer, simply trying to secure a decent, honest meal. The medieval street food experience, then, was not merely a matter of satisfying hunger. It was an education in skepticism, a daily lesson in the cunning of human nature, and a constant reminder that in a world without clear labels or strict regulations, your best defense was your sharpest wit, and perhaps, a healthy dose of suspicion. It was a world where a dishonest doughboy was not just a colorful character, but a very real threat to your stomach and your purse. The journey through the culinary landscape of the medieval street was paved with both genuine sustenance and artful deceit. You have navigated the treacherous waters of medieval commerce, learning to spot the trickster and the cheat. But now, let us peel back the crust of those dubious pies and peer into the very ingredients that formed the daily sustenance and often the daily peril of the common folk. You stand here amid the clamor and the stench and you wonder, what exactly are you about to put into your mouth? Forget, for a moment, the romanticized images of grand feasts and roasted boars. For the vast majority, the reality of eating in a medieval town was a much grimmer, and frankly, a far more disgusting affair. Your stomach churns slightly as you consider the possibilities, the grim lottery of every bite. The air itself carries a rich tapestry of odors, a testament to the unregulated urban environment. The sweet, cloying smell of decaying refuse mingles with the sharp tang of animal waste and the acrid smoke from countless cooking fires. Beneath it all, there is a persistent underlying odor of things not entirely fresh, a subtle warning sign to your senses. Consider the raw materials, the very foundation of any meal. Meat, for example. When you see a vendor hawking roasted morsels from a spit, your mind might conjure images of plump, healthy animals. The reality was often quite different. Animals destined for the street stalls were rarely the prime cuts, the finest specimens. Instead, you would encounter the offal, the lungs, the liver, the tripe, the intestines. These parts, scorned by the wealthy, were the affordable, calorie-dense options for the poor. They were often sourced from animals that had died from natural causes, or were simply too old or too diseased to fetch a good price at market. You might see a butcher quickly carving up a carcass that has sat a little too long, its skin already taking on a greenish tinge, its odor growing more pungent with each passing hour. The concept of refrigeration was, of course, centuries away. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or simply cooked immediately, often before it had a chance to truly spoil. But, immediately, was a flexible term in a world without health inspectors. You watch as a vendor slaps a piece of what might once have been beef onto a griddle, the flies already buzzing around the exposed flesh, landing and taking off with casual indifference. You see the vendor swatting them away, but their presence is a constant, unwelcome companion to every meal. Pies, that ubiquitous medieval fast food, were perhaps the ultimate culinary gamble. The thick, often inedible pastry served as a convenient container, but also as a perfect shroud for mystery. What truly lay within that crust? You are told it is pigeon or perhaps rabbit. But the truth could be far more unsettling. Scraps of various meats, often indistinguishable once minced and heavily spiced, were common. Sometimes the fillings were from animals caught in traps, roadkill, or even carrion, disguised by strong seasonings like pepper, ginger, and cumin. These spices were expensive, yes, but essential for masking the telltale signs of decomposition. You take a bite and the rich, greasy flavor hits your tongue, but in the back of your mind a tiny voice asks, What was that? Was it truly pigeon or something far less savory? Then there are the pottages and stews, bubbling endlessly in enormous cauldrons over open fires. These were the ultimate waste not, want not meals. Into these pots went anything and everything available: stale bread, vegetable scraps, a few bones for flavor, and those aforementioned awful cuts. The stew might simmer for days, constantly topped up with new ingredients and more water, the flavors blending into a murky, indistinct broth. While this slow cooking could render tough meats tender and make food digestible, it also meant that a single bad ingredient could contaminate the entire pot. You lean over a steaming cauldron, inhaling the thick, heavy aroma. It smells hearty, yes, but also a little off. A layer of grease shimmers on the surface, catching the flickering firelight, and you can only guess at the age of the ingredients submerged within. Fish, a vital source of protein, presented its own set of challenges. If you were fortunate enough to live near the coast, you might get genuinely fresh catches. But for inland towns, river fish or preserved sea fish were the norm. River fish carried the risks of polluted waterways, sometimes teeming with parasites. Preserved fish, usually salted or smoked, was often tough and intensely salty, requiring long soaking to make it palatable. But even then, if the preservation process was flawed, you ran the risk of consuming fish that had begun to rot from the inside out, a truly vile experience. You recall the stench of the fish market earlier, a smell that lingered long after you had left its crowded aisles. Even something as fundamental as bread was not immune to the gross realities of medieval street food. The flour itself was often adulterated. Millers were notorious for adding cheaper fillers to their grain: chalk, sawdust, even ground beans or peas to bulk it out. Your daily loaf, a staple of every meal, might contain more than just wheat. Furthermore, the storage of grain was primitive, making it susceptible to infestations of weevils, rats, and mice. You bite into a crusty roll, and notice a distinct grittiness, a texture that is not quite right. Is it just coarse flour or something else entirely? A fleeting thought of insects, of rodent droppings, passes through your mind and you quickly push it away. Drinks, particularly ale and beer, were often considered safer than water, which was notoriously contaminated. However, even these could be unpleasant. Alewives were known to water down their brews, but sometimes they would use spoiled grains or contaminated water anyway, resulting in a sour, unpalatable, and potentially sickening drink. You raise a wooden tankard to your lips, the ale warm and slightly flat, with a strange yeasty aftertaste. It quenches your thirst, but you cannot help but wonder about its true provenance. The environment itself conspired against any notion of cleanliness. Streets were open sewers filled with the waste of humans and animals alike. Market stalls were not scrubbed down with hot water and soap after each use. They were wiped, perhaps, with a dirty rag, then left exposed to the elements, to the dust, the flies, and the vermin. When you observe a vendor preparing food, you notice their hands are grimy, their clothes stained. Water for washing was a precious commodity, rarely wasted on mere hygiene when it was needed for cooking or drinking. You watch as a vendor scoops a spoonful of what appears to be a gruel from a large pot. His thumb dips into the mixture as he does so, then he wipes it on his leather apron, already caked with the remnants of countless previous meals. You suppress a shudder. This is not a world of sterile kitchens or food safety standards. This is a world where practicality trumps purity, where hunger overrides fastidiousness. The concept of food poisoning was not understood as a bacterial infection, but rather attributed to bad humors or a curse, or simply the natural order of things. Illness was a constant companion in medieval life, and stomach ailments were practically a given. You learn to live with a perpetual low-level discomfort, a constant awareness that your next meal might be the one that lays you low for a day or two. The risks are simply part of the package, an accepted hazard of living. So, as you walk down the bustling street, past the steaming stalls and the shouted prices, you carry with you a new understanding. The food here is not just an item of commerce. It is a testament to resilience, a gamble with your health, and a constant reminder of the brutal realities of survival. Every bite is an act of faith, a leap into the unknown. The medieval menu, particularly on the streets, was a stark reflection of a hard world, where disgusting was often a luxury one could not afford to acknowledge too deeply, when the alternative was simply going hungry. You look at the food, then at your purse, and then at your stomach, and you make your choice, hoping for the best and steeling yourself for the worst. The flavors, the textures, the smells, they are all part of this visceral, unvarnished journey into the past. It is a full sensory immersion whether you want it or not. You have tasted the smoke, inhaled the spices, and felt the grime of the medieval street clinging to your clothes. But a truly comprehensive sensory immersion, one that chills you to the bone, must also acknowledge the unseen, or perhaps, the all-too-seen inhabitants sharing every morsel, every corner, every breath of this world. You notice the shadows that flit just at the edge of your vision, the quick rustle beneath a discarded crate, the persistent hum in the air around the butcher's stall. These are not merely background elements. They are active participants in your dining experience, whether you choose to acknowledge them or not. You stand by a vendor hawking hot peas porridge. The steam rises, momentarily obscuring your view, but as the breeze shifts, you see them. Flies. Not just a few, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, swarming with an almost frantic energy over the open vat, alighting on the wooden spoon, crawling across the rim of the cellar's serving bowl. Their tiny, segmented bodies seem to dance a macabre ballet over the food meant for human consumption. You watch one land, its delicate legs tracing invisible patterns on the surface of the thick, gray gruel, before it takes flight again, undoubtedly carrying remnants of the nearby refuse pit or the stable where the vendor slept last night. The buzzing is a constant drone, a high-pitched whine that becomes a part of the city's ambient noise, blending with the cries of merchants and the creak of cart wheels. You swat at one that lands on your cheek, a futile gesture. For every one you deter, 5 more seem to materialize from the very air itself. They are drawn by the sweet decay of dropped fruit, the rich aroma of roasting meat, the fermenting juices of spilt ale, and the ever-present effluvium of human and animal waste. To eat in the open air, as you invariably must with street food, is to share your meal with a cloud of these tiny winged scavengers. They are the uninvited guests at every feast, carrying unseen cargo from filth to food, from disease to your very palate. And then there are the scurrying shadows. You are waiting for a turnover filled with spiced meat, watching the baker pull it from a primitive oven. The heat is intense, the smell of baking bread comforting. But as you glance down, a movement catches your eye. A rat, sleek and quick, darting from beneath a pile of wood used for fuel. It pauses, its beady eyes scanning the surroundings, its whiskers twitching, before disappearing just as swiftly into a gap in the stone wall behind the stall. You realize that its home is likely within feet of where your food is prepared and stored. This is the reality of medieval life, a stark cohabitation with a persistent, formidable army of rodents. They infest every granary, every cellar, every market stall. They chew through sacks of grain, spoil stored meat, and contaminate water supplies. Their droppings are everywhere, small dark pellets that blend surprisingly well with the dust and detritus of the street. You might not see them directly in your food, but their presence is undeniable, an invisible threat of disease and spoilage. Imagine a vendor preparing a stew overnight, leaving it to cool in a large cauldron. You can almost picture the rats, emboldened by the darkness and quiet, slipping out from their hiding places. They are drawn to the warmth and scent of the simmering concoction. They might drink from it, leave their droppings in it, or even drown in it, becoming an unwelcome, unidentifiable ingredient that is likely simply scooped out by a less than fastidious cook in the morning. To waste a cauldron of stew, especially one that has taken hours to prepare and uses valuable ingredients, would be an unthinkable economic loss. So, the stew is sold, perhaps with an added layer of flavor that you would rather not contemplate. Mice, smaller and perhaps less terrifying than their larger cousins, are no less pervasive. They nibble at loaves of bread left uncovered, sample cheeses, and leave tiny telltale signs of their passage across every surface. You might purchase a piece of fruit from a street vendor, only to discover a small, almost imperceptible gnaw mark on its skin. A tiny detail, perhaps, but one that speaks volumes about the journey that food has taken before it reaches your hand. Even the very surfaces you might eat from are rarely clean. Wooden tables are porous, scarred with knife marks, and perpetually damp with spilt liquids. They offer countless crevices for germs and for smaller, less visible pests. You might lean against a wall while you eat, oblivious to the fact that fleas or lice could be making their way from the stone or from a passing stranger onto your clothing, ready to embark on a new journey. Personal hygiene, as you know, is not a priority here, and so these parasites thrive, making their presence felt in every corner of daily life. Consider the common sight of waste in the street. Food scraps, animal entrails from the butcher, human effluent from overflowing privies, all mingle in the gutters. This refuse is a banquet for the vermin. It fuels their populations and creates a perfect breeding ground. The very air you breathe, heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth, also carries the unseen spores and bacteria that flourish in such an environment. When a fly lands on a pile of festering waste, then moments later on your hot pie, it is performing a deadly transfer, a microscopic bridge between disease and sustenance. This acceptance of vermin, this silent truce, is not born of indifference but of sheer impossibility. How do you eradicate rats from a city built of wood and stone, with open sewers and constant waste? How do you keep flies away from food stalls when there are no screens, no refrigeration, and no effective pest control? You cannot. So you learn to live with it. You might swat, you might curse, but ultimately, you understand that these creatures are as much a part of the urban landscape as the cobblestones beneath your feet. The vendors themselves operate within these constraints. A dedicated vendor might try to shoo away the worst of the flies, or cover their goods with a thin cloth when not serving. But these are superficial measures, largely symbolic. They cannot fight the tide. They are often as poor as their customers, living in similar conditions, and equally resigned to the constant presence of these unwelcome neighbors. Their priority is to sell their goods, to earn enough to survive another day. The hygiene standards that you take for granted in your own time are simply inconceivable here. You might find yourself trying to eat a piece of roasted fowl, carefully picking around areas that look suspicious, wondering if that small dark mark is merely a burnt spot or something far more unsettling. The experience adds a layer of anxiety to your meal, a constant vigilance against the invisible dangers lurking in every bite. It transforms the act of eating from a simple pleasure into a calculated risk, a game of chance. The medieval palate, you realize, was not merely accustomed to strong flavors and rough textures. It was also conditioned to tolerate or at least ignore the constant threat of contamination. The sheer need for calories often outweighed any delicate sensibilities regarding hygiene. A stomach growling with hunger tends to silence the concerns of a fastidious mind. If you are fortunate enough to have a few coins and the food is available, you eat it. You do not ask too many questions about its journey from farm or forest to your hand. So, as you chew your street-bought morsel, perhaps a piece of cheese or a pastry, you consider the tiny legs that might have crawled across its surface, the droppings that might have been brushed away, the unseen pathogens that might cling to its crust. It is a sobering thought, a truly disgusting reality, but it is also an indelible part of the tapestry of medieval street life. The pervasive presence of vermin is a stark reminder of the fragile balance between sustenance and sickness, between life and death, in a world where the wild constantly encroached upon the human, and cleanliness was a rare luxury indeed. The air itself seems to hum with their presence, an unsettling, inescapable chorus that accompanies every meal. You are eating, yes, but you are never truly eating alone. You are sharing your repast with an entire ecosystem of invisible and often visible life. You learn to ignore the twitch of a cockroach near the edges of the vendor's display, or the quick sweep of a hand to dislodge a beetle from a pile of dried fish. These are minor details in the grand scheme of survival. The constant struggle for food meant that one simply could not afford to be too squeamish. The risk of disease from a contaminated meal was high, but the certainty of hunger from not eating at all was a more immediate, more terrifying prospect. This is the truth of medieval street food. It is a gamble every single time, with the dice loaded against you by the very environment itself, teeming with life that thrives on human presence and human waste. Your meal is an uneasy truce in a constant war against the unseen. The invisible war against contamination, the quiet struggle against the unseen, often ended in a very visible, very painful defeat. You might think you have won the day, satisfied your hunger, but the true battle was only just beginning within your own body. The delicious aroma of that hot pasty, still warm in your hands, could be a Trojan horse, concealing an army of pathogens ready to lay siege to your gut. Consider for a moment the journey of that pasty. It did not spring from a sterile kitchen. It was born of the street, steeped in its very essence. The meat tucked inside, perhaps beef or mutton, was likely purchased from a market stall that had seen better days and perhaps better smells. Animals, driven long distances, were often slaughtered on the spot or very nearby, in conditions that would make a modern butcher blanch. The heat of the day, the flies buzzing thick over the carcasses, the lack of immediate chilling. These were not minor inconveniences. They were fertile grounds for bacteria. If an animal was already sick, its disease could easily transfer into the meat. The vendor, keen to turn a profit, might not disclose the full history of their wares. A slight discoloration, a dubious odor, could be masked with strong spices, or simply overlooked by customers desperate for a cheap meal. Then there is the pastry itself. Flour, often stored in sacks vulnerable to rodents and insects, mixed with water. Water. Think about the water you encounter in this city. It is drawn from communal wells, from rivers that serve as open sewers, from sources where human and animal waste is a constant presence. Pure, clean water is a luxury. Your baker might boil it, yes, but often not vigorously or consistently enough to kill every lurking danger. And the hands that knead the dough? They have touched coin, handled raw meat, swatted flies, adjusted clothing. A quick rinse in a communal bucket of murky water might be the extent of their hygiene. There is no running water, no soap as you know it, no understanding of germ theory. The concept of microscopic enemies is utterly alien. As the pasty bakes, some of these dangers are reduced, but not all. The interior, especially if it is large and densely packed, might not reach a high enough temperature to sterilize every morsel. And after baking it sits on a wooden cart, exposed to the swirling dust of the street, the droppings of pigeons, the curious investigations of stray dogs and cats. Flies, those tireless vectors of disease, alight on its surface, depositing whatever they have picked up from the nearby overflowing cesspit or the contents of a discarded chamber pot. Every minute it waits for a buyer, it collects more invisible passengers. You buy it, perhaps because it is hot and fills your empty belly with comforting warmth. You eat it quickly, oblivious. But within hours, or perhaps a day, the reckoning begins. A gnawing discomfort in your stomach turns into cramping. A slight nausea escalates into violent vomiting. The quick trip to the privy becomes a desperate, agonizing dash. You are afflicted with dysentery, a common and terrifyingly prevalent illness. Your body expels everything, dehydrating you rapidly. Fever sets in, your limbs ache, your head throbs. This is not just a bad stomach ache. This is a life-threatening condition in an age without antibiotics, without intravenous fluids, without a modern understanding of rehydration. Or perhaps it is food poisoning, a rapid onset of debilitating sickness that leaves you weak and wrung out for days. You might attribute it to a chill or a curse or simply bad luck. You might never connect it directly to that delicious pasty you ate yesterday because every meal is a roll of the dice. Parasites, invisible worms and protozoa, are also constant companions, slowly sapping your strength, causing chronic discomfort, and leaving you vulnerable to other infections. The street itself is a vast, open-air laboratory for disease transmission. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food scraps, stagnant puddles, all mingle in a potent brew. The very air you breathe carries the effluvium of this organic decay. When a vendor prepares food on the street, they are not just cooking. They are actively integrating their product with this highly pathogenic environment. Imagine a vendor stirring a stew, a fly landing on the spoon, then dipping back into the communal pot. Imagine a piece of bread falling onto the grimy cobblestones, perhaps brushed off quickly and sold anyway. Imagine the hands that take your coin, sticky with grime, then reach for the food you are about to purchase. There is no concept of best before dates. There is no refrigeration. Food is preserved through salting, smoking, drying, or pickling, methods that are effective but not foolproof. And many street foods like the pasty, the stew, the roasted meats, are meant to be consumed fresh. But fresh often means cooked today, not safe today. Leftovers might be reheated and sold the next day, or the day after, a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. The economic pressures are immense. Throwing away food means lost income, a stark choice for a vendor living close to the margins. So often the questionable is sold alongside the acceptable, hoping the customer will not notice, or that they are too hungry to care. You, the customer, are often in a desperate situation. You are a laborer, a messenger, a traveler, someone without the means or the time to prepare your own meal. You rely on the convenience and affordability of street food. You know the risks, perhaps subconsciously, from observing others fall ill, or from your own past experiences. But what is the alternative? Go hungry? Work on an empty stomach? The choice is often between an uncertain risk of sickness and the certainty of immediate suffering. So you gamble. You take the chance. And when sickness strikes, what then? There are no readily available doctors, no pharmacies as you understand them. Perhaps an apothecary offers dubious concoctions, or a barber surgeon performs rudimentary, often dangerous, treatments. More likely, you are left to the ministrations of family members, or simply to your own body's ability to fight off the infection. Recovery is slow if it comes at all. You lose days, perhaps weeks of work. Your meager savings are depleted. You become weaker, more vulnerable, trapped in a cycle where your need for cheap, convenient food directly contributes to your ill health and impoverishment. The price of that pasty was not just a few coins. It was a gamble with your health, a wager with your very life. Every bite carried the potential for misery, for incapacitation, for a slow, agonizing decline. This was the silent, deadly tax levied by the medieval street, a constant reminder that convenience often came at an unbearable cost. The unseen war had very real, very grim casualties, and you, the eater, were always on the front lines.